pick it up. You wanted it, didn't you?
Thank you.
The lobby of the Grand Meridian Hotel had a particular kind of silence on busy afternoons, the kind that existed beneath the noise, underneath the clinking of glassware, and the murmur of well-dressed guests, beneath the soft piano drifting from somewhere near the east corridor. It was the silence of money, of careful performance, of a world that had decided long ago which people belonged and which people did not. On that particular Thursday afternoon, in late September, the marble floors gleamed under the light of 3 enormous crystal chandeliers, each one imported from a glassmaker in Bohemia, each one casting the kind of warm golden glow that made even ordinary conversations feel important. Bellhops moved like choreographed dancers. The front desk staff smiled with practiced precision. Everything about the Grand Meridian said one thing clearly. This place was not for everyone. Angela Brooks stepped through the revolving glass doors at 3:47 in the afternoon, carrying a weathered canvas tote bag over one shoulder and pulling a small rolling suitcase behind her, a suitcase that had clearly seen better decades, its corners soft with wear, its zipper pull replaced at some point with a keychain from a gas station somewhere in the Midwest. She was 45 years old, dressed in dark slacks, a plain cream-colored blouse, and a pair of flat shoes that were comfortable rather than fashionable. No jewelry beyond simple gold studs in her ears. No designer logo anywhere visible. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat, low bun, and she wore no makeup except for a faint application of tinted lip balm. She looked, to anyone applying the shallow calculus of appearances, like a woman who had taken a long flight and was hoping to rest her feet. She had come alone, deliberately, purposefully, completely alone, and that aloneness was not a vulnerability but a tool, carefully chosen and precisely applied, the way all of Angela's most effective instruments were. No assistant waiting at the curb, no security detail hovering nearby, no advance team that would have called ahead and warned the staff that someone important was coming. That was exactly the point. Angela had learned years ago that the truest measure of any hospitality business was not how it treated the guests who announced themselves with reservations and entourages and platinum credit cards. The truest measure was how it treated the person who walked in off the street looking like they might not belong. She had conducted this kind of visit before, quiet, unannounced, unremarkable on purpose, and every time, the results taught her something that no financial report could replicate. The Grand Meridian had been on the acquisition list for 7 months. Her team at Brooks Meridian Holdings had run the numbers 3 times. The property was well located, solidly built, and had strong occupancy rates. On paper, it was an attractive investment. But Angela had a rule she never broke. Before signing anything, she visited in person. Not as the CEO of a luxury hospitality conglomerate. Not as the woman whose name was on the letterhead of one of the fastest-growing hotel groups in North America. Just as a woman walking through a door, seeing what she would see, feeling what any guest would feel. She had killed deals over less than what she suspected she might find here. She had also saved deals by discovering that what looked mediocre on paper was exceptional in practice. The visit was not a formality. It was the whole thing. She approached the front desk with the quiet confidence of someone who had stood in 10,000 rooms and never once needed a room to tell her who she was. The young man at the desk, his name tag read. Marcus glanced up, and then, just briefly, back down at his screen before looking up again. It was a small thing. A flicker. The kind of micro-assessment that happened in less than a second, and yet communicated volumes. He did not smile immediately the way he had smiled at the couple who had checked in just before her. A white couple in business attire who had been greeted with, "Welcome back to the Grand Meridian. How wonderful to have you." For Angela, there was a pause. Then a professionally neutral, "Can I help you?" Angela asked about the coffee bar in the lobby and whether walk-in guests were welcome. Marcus told her yes, in the tone of someone answering a question they considered beneath them. She thanked him and moved toward the lobby seating area. She found a chair near the center of the room, a high-backed velvet chair in deep navy, positioned near the coffee bar and with a clear view of the main floor operations. She settled in, pulled out her phone, and opened a notes application. She began to observe. She noticed the way the lobby staff moved, who they gravitated toward, who they lingered with, whose luggage they rushed to assist without being asked. She noticed the couple near the window, who had been offered complimentary newspapers. She noticed the businessman by the pillar, who had been brought a glass of sparkling water unprompted. She sat in her Navy chair for 12 minutes before anyone asked if she needed anything. When a server finally did approach her, the offer was brief and unaccompanied by the warmth she had observed directed elsewhere. She ordered a coffee. Black, no sugar. The server nodded and left without elaboration. The patterns were clear within the first 20 minutes. The service at the Grand Meridian was not uniformly excellent. It was selectively excellent, applied like a spotlight that illuminated some guests and left others in careful shadow. Angela had seen this before. She had seen it in hotels she had chosen not to acquire. She had also seen it in properties she had purchased, and then systematically rebuilt from the inside out, starting always with the culture before touching a single piece of furniture. She made her notes methodically, her expression giving away nothing. To anyone watching, she might have been a tired traveler checking her messages. To herself, she was building a case. What she did not yet know was that she was also being watched. Daniel Carter had worked at the Grand Meridian for 9 years. He had started as an assistant manager and climbed, through a combination of results-focused efficiency and an aggressive willingness to cut corners that no one above him ever looked at closely enough, to the position of operations manager. He was 38 years old, trim, perpetually dressed in a suit that was one size too well fitted, and possessed of the particular brand of confidence that comes not from genuine achievement, but from the unchallenged assumption that one's own judgment is superior. He had been told he was good at his job often enough, and by the right people often enough, that he had stopped questioning whether those evaluations were accurate. He managed the Grand Meridian, the way a man manages a kingdom he considers rightfully his, with absolute certainty that he understood the hierarchy better than anyone else. Daniel had a system. It was not written down anywhere, not part of any official protocol, but it was real and consistent, and the staff understood it without being told explicitly. Guests were assessed on arrival, not their character, not their mood, not their genuine needs, their appearance. Their luggage, their clothing, their companions, their demeanor of affluence or its absence. Guests who passed the visual assessment received the full treatment. Proactive assistance, warm greetings, the unofficial extras that never appeared on any invoice but made people feel like royalty and drove repeat bookings. Guests who did not pass received competent but minimal service enough to avoid complaints, not enough to inspire enthusiasm. Daniel believed this was simply smart business. Why invest energy in guests who were unlikely to generate significant revenue? He had never once considered that his assumptions about who was likely to generate revenue were built entirely on prejudice rather than evidence. He spotted Angela from the mezzanine level at approximately 4 o'clock. He had been doing a walkthrough of the main floor, which he did twice daily, surveying his domain with the methodical eye of someone who took pleasure in small authority. He saw the woman in the plain blouse sitting in the Navy chair near the coffee bar, her worn suitcase beside her, making notes on her phone. He watched her for a moment. She had not checked in at the front desk. He would have been notified. She had purchased a coffee, it appeared. She was taking up a premium lobby chair during a busy afternoon. She did not look, by Daniel's ruthlessly shallow measure, like she belonged in that chair. He descended the mezzanine stairs and made his way toward the front desk, stopping to speak quietly with one of the junior staff members, a young woman named Priya, who had been working at the Grand Meridian for less than 3 months and had already learned, through the invisible instruction of workplace culture, that Daniel's preferences were to be followed without question. The woman in the Navy chair near the coffee station, he said, in the tone of a man issuing directions on a matter of no great importance. Don't spend too much time on her. Focus your attention where it's going to count. Priya looked briefly toward Angela, looked back at Daniel, and nodded with the compliance of someone who does not yet have enough standing to push back. Daniel straightened his jacket and moved on. He said it to 2 other staff members over the next 20 minutes, in slightly different words each time, but with the same meaning. Don't waste your time on guests who don't look like they're going to matter. He said it casually, as though he were offering professional guidance rather than encoding discrimination into the rhythm of an afternoon's work. He would have objected strenuously to the word discrimination. He would have said he was being strategic, The word he would never have used, the word that would have required a kind of self-examination he had trained himself out of, was prejudice. Angela watched all of this from her Navy chair. She could not hear what was said, but she had spent 25 years in the hospitality industry, and she could read a room the way a musician reads sheet music, not one note at a time, but all at once, the full pattern emerging instantly from the arrangement of parts. She watched the staff recalibrate around her, the subtle way attention shifted, the small physics of neglect. She noted it. She kept her expression neutral, and her phone in her hand, and she waited. The coffee arrived eventually. It was fine, properly made, appropriately hot. She drank it and considered ordering a second cup, and decided she would, not because she needed the caffeine, but because she wanted to see how the transaction was handled. She finished the first cup, set it down, and when the server returned to clear it, she asked politely for another. The server, not the one who had originally taken her order, but a different one, a young man whose name tag she couldn't quite read from the angle, looked at her with the same carefully managed indifference that she had been receiving since she walked through the door. He took the order and left. She paid when the second coffee arrived. She counted out the bills carefully. She had brought cash deliberately, another variable in her assessment, and handed them to the person at the small cafe counter. The total was $9.50. She gave a 10 and a 5. The correct change was $5.50. Daniel Carter had positioned himself behind the service counter at that moment, not because he was scheduled to work the cafe, but because he had decided, in the way that petty authority sometimes expresses itself through unnecessary involvement, to supervise the transaction personally. There was no operational reason for him to be there. He was there because something about Angela's continued, composed, note-taking presence in his lobby had begun to irritate him in a way he could not articulate, and therefore chose to act on rather than examine. He had seen Angela hand over the cash. He had watched the calculation made. And then, with the deliberateness of a man who wanted to make a point that he could not have explained in honest language, he took the change, a $5 bill and 2 quarters, and instead of placing it in Angela's waiting hand, he set it on the edge of the counter, and then, as if by accident, that was not an accident at all, he let it go. The coins hit the marble floor, with 2 sharp, flat sounds. The bill floated down more slowly, settling near her left shoe. 1 quarter rolled almost 2 feet away, coming to rest against the leg of a nearby bar stool. The lobby, in the particular acoustic way of marble-floored spaces, amplified the sound. Several heads turned. Daniel looked at Angela with the expression of a man who had just done something he believed was beneath consequence. His voice, when he spoke, was unhurried. "Pick it up." The silence that followed was of a different quality than the comfortable ambient silence the Grand Meridian cultivated. This was the silence of held breath. 3 people at nearby tables had looked up from their drinks. A couple waiting near the elevator had paused mid-conversation. A hotel staff member near the concierge desk had gone very still. The moment had that particular crystalline quality of an event that everyone in the room would later be able to recall precisely. The angle of the afternoon light through the lobby windows, the faint sound of the piano from the east corridor, the 2 coins on the floor, and the bill near the woman's left shoe. Angela Brooks looked down at the money on the floor. She stood still for a moment. The air around her seemed to hold something complicated, not anger, not humiliation, something harder to name and more difficult to dismiss. She looked at the bill by her shoe. She looked at the quarter near the bar stool. She looked at Daniel Carter with the steady, unhurried regard of a woman who has nothing to prove and therefore does not feel the urgency that comes with having something to prove. Then she bent down, without drama and without haste, and she picked up the bill and both coins. She stood up, tucked the money into her tote bag, looked at Daniel, and smiled. It was a genuine smile, composed and warm, and carrying no trace of the rage that the situation would have justified in almost any other human being. "Thank you," she said. Daniel blinked. He had expected something: embarrassment, protest, the flustered exit of someone who had been made to feel small, and knew it. The calm he received instead disconcerted him in a way he could not immediately name. He recovered with the ease of a man accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room he occupied, and therefore unaccustomed to feeling wrong-footed. He turned and walked away. Behind him, the lobby slowly exhaled. People returned to their drinks, and their conversations. The piano played on. Angela returned to her Navy chair. She sat down, opened her notes application, and typed for 3 solid minutes without stopping. The afternoon moved forward. Guests came and went through the revolving glass doors. Luggage was transported upstairs. The chandeliers continued their golden work overhead. Angela sat and observed and made her notes, and if anyone looked carefully at her face, which no one did, because people had already decided she was not worth looking at carefully, they might have noticed that the smile she had directed at Daniel Carter had not entirely faded. It had settled into something quieter, the expression of a person who is watching a situation unfold exactly as expected and is waiting patiently for the rest of it. She received 4 phone calls between 4:15 and 5 o'clock. She took each one with the phone held close to her ear, speaking in a low, measured voice, and any staff member who happened to pass near enough to catch fragments of the conversation would have heard words like due diligence, acquisition timeline, and I'll make the final determination by end of week. She did not make these calls loudly. She was not performing. She simply had a business to run, and the business did not pause, because she was in the middle of conducting a field assessment at a potential acquisition target. One person did hear something, though it was not any of those words. Priya, the junior staff member whom Daniel had directed earlier in the afternoon, had been restocking the cafe counter near Angela's chair and had not moved away quickly enough when Angela's 4th call of the afternoon came in. Priya heard only a fragment, just a few words at the very end of the call as the person on the other end of the line said something that made their respect audible even through the speaker of a phone several feet away. "Of course, ma'am. Whatever you decide, we'll move forward accordingly." Priya stood with a stack of paper coffee sleeves in both hands and looked at this woman in the plain blouse in the Navy chair and felt, for just a moment, the disorienting sensation of a world rearranging itself around a new piece of information. She filed it away. She was 23 years old and relatively new to the workforce, and she had not yet developed the vocabulary for what she suspected, but did not yet know. She restocked the sleeves and went back to her station. Daniel had noticed the phone calls, too. He had not been close enough to hear their content, but he had noticed the frequency, and he had noticed the way Angela held herself, while taking them, not the posture of someone receiving personal calls, but the upright, focused posture of professional engagement. He noticed because Daniel, for all his considerable faults, was not entirely unobservant. He was simply selective in what he chose to observe and what conclusions he allowed himself to draw from his observations. The woman in the plain blouse receiving professional phone calls could mean anything. It meant nothing specific enough to disturb his certainty about her. He returned to his scheduled walkthrough of the East Wing and did not think about her again for 45 minutes. At 5:20 in the afternoon, the hotel's general manager, a nervous and perpetually over-caffeinated man named Richard Holloway, received a call from the corporate office. It was brief, and it was unmistakably urgent. When he hung up the phone, his face had the look of a man who has just realized that what he thought was an ordinary Thursday was in fact something else entirely. He walked out of his office, found his assistant, and said quietly, "I need the senior management team in the conference room in 10 minutes. Tell them it's mandatory." By 5:35, 7 people were seated around the oval conference table in the second-floor meeting room, including Daniel Carter, who had arrived with his usual composed authority and was now listening with decreasing composure as Richard Holloway explained that the prospective buyer for the Grand Meridian, the one whose acquisition team had been running numbers for months, the one whose offer represented a potential deal in the hundreds of millions of dollars, the one whose decision would determine whether the hotel continued as an independent property or became part of one of the most successful luxury hospitality groups in the country, had sent a representative to conduct a preliminary site visit today, unannounced. The representative had been on site for approximately 2 hours. The final decision-maker was expected to arrive at the hotel within the next 30 minutes for an introductory meeting with hotel leadership. The room absorbed this information with varying degrees of alarm. Several managers immediately began reviewing the afternoon's incident log in their minds, cataloging anything that might have gone wrong. Richard Holloway loosened his tie. Daniel Carter sat very still. At 5:58, 2 black SUVs pulled up to the front of the Grand Meridian, and a group of 6 people emerged, 4 of them carrying the unmistakable air of senior corporate executives. the kind of people who move through spaces with the economy of motion that comes from spending decades in boardrooms and conference centers and first-class cabins. They were dressed precisely. They were unhurried. They walked through the revolving doors of the Grand Meridian lobby with the clear intention of people who knew exactly where they were going, and they walked directly, without slowing, without looking around, toward the Navy chair near the coffee bar where a woman in a plain cream blouse was putting her phone in her tote bag. They stopped in front of Angela Brooks, the most senior-looking of the group, a tall man in a charcoal suit named Harrison Webb, who was in fact the chief operating officer of Brooks Meridian Holdings, said, "Miss Brooks, the team is ready for you whenever you'd like to proceed." And then, without any ambiguity at all, he offered Angela the kind of deferential half-bow that is not a formal gesture, but rather the involuntary physical expression of genuine professional respect. Angela stood up from the Navy chair. She thanked Harrison. She said she was ready. Behind the front desk, Priya stood holding a pen she had stopped moving several minutes ago. Near the east corridor, one of the servers from the cafe was frozen mid-step with a tray of empty glasses. And at the far end of the lobby, having come downstairs for an unrelated reason at exactly the wrong or exactly the right moment, Daniel Carter stood next to the elevator bank and watched a woman he had told his staff not to waste time on receive the undivided, reverential attention of 6 senior executives from what was apparently a company large enough and important enough that even Richard Holloway, when he appeared at the top of the stairs a moment later, nearly tripped in his hurry to get to her. The color left Daniel Carter's face in a way that had nothing to do with the lobby's lighting. The meeting that followed took place in the Grand Meridian's executive conference suite on the 4th floor. Angela sat at the head of the table, a position she had not requested, but which the hotel's management team had arranged with the instinctive choreography of people who have just realized what the situation requires. Richard Holloway introduced her formally to the senior managers, who had not yet connected her name to the woman who had been sitting in the lobby all afternoon. The introductions produced a series of expressions that ranged from professional composure to barely concealed shock. Daniel Carter was the last to be introduced. He stood up when his name was called, as the others had, and he extended his hand to Angela with the careful control of a man who was working very hard to keep his face still. Angela shook his hand. She did not say anything to indicate that she remembered him. Her expression was the same composed, pleasant regard she had given everyone else in the room. If she was watching for something in his face, and she was nothing in her own face, revealed it. The meeting proceeded through the agenda Harrison had prepared. Angela asked questions that were sharp, specific, and entirely focused on operational details: staffing ratios, customer complaint resolution processes, employee turnover in the past 3 years, how the management team handled feedback that was critical of leadership. She took no notes visibly, though Harrison's assistant documented everything. She was attentive and economical in her language, and she never once smiled in the performed way that business meetings often produce. At one point, she paused in the middle of a discussion about service standards and said, almost conversationally, "Can someone pull the customer satisfaction surveys from the last 12 months? Specifically, any complaints or concerns related to staff conduct. I'd like to see those before we close today." There was a brief silence. Richard Holloway said he would have that information pulled together immediately. Daniel Carter said nothing. He was looking at the surface of the conference table with the expression of a man reading something that is not written there. The surveys arrived in printed form 20 minutes later, delivered by a hotel administrator who set them on the table in front of Angela with the careful quietness of someone carrying something they suspect might be delicate. Angela read through them in a silence that no one in the room attempted to interrupt. She read with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who is not surprised by what they are finding, but is nonetheless giving it the weight it deserves. There were 23 complaints in the 12-month period related to staff conduct or service quality. Of those, 14 had been formally logged in the hotel's system. 9 had not. Of the 14 that were logged, 6 had received follow-up responses from management. The other 8 had been closed without documented resolution. The 9 that were never logged had reached Angela's team through a separate channel, the independent review aggregator that Brooks Meridian's acquisition team used as part of their due diligence process, a layer of review that the hotel's own management had no knowledge of, and therefore had not thought to manage. The complaints described a pattern, Guests who felt they had been treated differently, less warmly, less attentively, less respectfully based on their appearance or their perceived status. Two complaints specifically mentioned a manager who had made them feel unwelcome. One guest, a woman traveling alone on business, had written, "The operations manager looked at me like I didn't belong there. I've stayed in dozens of hotels for work. I have never been made to feel like an inconvenience before." The review had been submitted, flagged, and then, within the hotel's own system, quietly archived. Angela set the papers down on the table. She looked around the room. She looked at Daniel Carter for a moment longer than she looked at anyone else, and what she found in his face was not defiance but something that looked genuinely like a man beginning to understand the full weight of what he had done, not just today, not just in the lobby with the coins on the floor, but across years of small cruelties that had each felt, in the moment, like nothing at all. She said, "I want to be clear about how I evaluate a property I'm considering bringing into our group." Her voice was steady and unhurried, the voice of a person who has said important things in difficult rooms for a long time. "I don't start with the revenue numbers, though those matter. I don't start with the renovation costs or the location metrics. I start with service culture, because service culture is the only thing about a hotel that can't be fixed by spending money. You can renovate a lobby. You cannot renovate the instinct of your staff to treat some guests as less worthy of care than others. That instinct either exists or it doesn't, and if it exists, it will find its way into every interaction regardless of how beautiful the rooms are." The room was quiet. Outside, through the tall windows of the conference suite, the city was going about its Thursday evening. "The Grand Meridian has a service culture problem," Angela continued. "I've documented it in the 3 hours I was in this building before anyone knew who I was. Your own customer surveys confirm it, including surveys that were never formally acknowledged. This is not a small issue. It is not an occasional lapse. It is a pattern, and patterns have sources." She paused. "I'll say directly what I suspect most people in this room already understand. Patterns of selective service. Service that is warm and generous for guests who look a certain way and diminished for guests who do not, are almost always a reflection of leadership behavior. Staff follow what they see modeled. If leadership treats some guests as less important, staff will too." Daniel Carter did not look up from the table. Richard Holloway said, with the careful steadiness of a man trying to stay professional while his world restructured itself around him, "Miss Brooks, I can assure you that what you've observed does not represent the values of this hotel. We take these findings very seriously, and I will personally ensure that." Angela raised one hand, slightly, and Richard Holloway stopped speaking. "I appreciate that," she said, "and I'm going to take you at your word, Mr. Holloway. What I require, in order for this acquisition to move forward, is not an assurance. It is a change." She let the word settle. "The operations manager role will need new leadership. I do not make this decision lightly, and I am not making it in anger. I am making it because the evidence is consistent, and because the culture of a team reflects the standards set by the people who lead it. A different standard requires different leadership." The room absorbed this. Harrison Webb, seated to Angela's left, made a note. Richard Holloway nodded once, the nod of a man accepting something he has understood was coming for longer than this afternoon. Daniel Carter sat very still in his chair, and the stillness had a different quality now than the composed authority it had carried earlier. It was the stillness of a man who has been measured by a standard he did not know existed and found profoundly, consequentially, irrevocably lacking. Angela spoke for another 20 minutes. She outlined the conditions under which Brooks Meridian Holdings would proceed with the acquisition. A mandatory service culture training program for all guest-facing staff, implemented within 60 days. A formal whistleblower mechanism, allowing employees to report management conduct without fear of retaliation. A monthly customer feedback review conducted at the senior management level with documented response requirements. And an independent audit of the hotel's complaint resolution practices over the next 12 months. She presented these not as punishments, but as standards. The same standards that every property in her portfolio maintained. The standards that had made Brooks Meridian Holdings what it was. She did not shout. She did not express personal anger. She did not at any point reference the coins on the lobby floor or the 2 words that Daniel Carter had said to her in front of the afternoon crowd. She did not need to. Everyone in the room understood that the afternoon was the foundation of the conversation they were having. But Angela had not built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars by making decisions based on personal grievance. She made decisions based on evidence, and the evidence was comprehensive, and the decision was clear. Before she left the conference room, she looked at the assembled managers one final time and said something that no one who was in the room that day would forget. I have been in this industry for 25 years. I have walked into hundreds of hotels unannounced, in plain clothes, without staff, and I have watched how those hotels behaved when they thought no one important was watching. What I have learned is this: the way you treat a guest you think doesn't matter is the truest possible statement of your values, not the way you treat your VIP list, not the way you present yourself when you know someone is evaluating you. The way you treat the person you've decided isn't worth your full effort. That is who you are. She thanked the group for their time. She collected her tote bag from where she had left it near the door. She walked out of the conference suite with Harrison Webb and the rest of her team, and the door closed behind her with the soft, decisive click of a well-engineered latch. Daniel Carter resigned his position at the Grand Meridian 11 days later. The resignation was framed, in the language of official communications, as a mutual decision reached in the context of the hotel's upcoming transition to new ownership. In the quieter language of what had actually happened, it was the only outcome that had been available to him from the moment he let those coins fall to the floor. He spent the weeks after his departure doing the uncomfortable, necessary work of sitting with what he had done, not just in the lobby that afternoon, but across years of small dismissals and silent directives, and the gradual erosion of other people's dignity in service of his own sense of order. He thought about the 23 complaints. He thought about the one that had described him specifically, the one from the woman traveling alone who had written about never feeling like an inconvenience before. He thought about Priya, who had done nothing except follow the culture she had been handed. He thought, for perhaps the first time in 9 years of managing people, about what it had felt like to be the person on the receiving end of his system. It was not comfortable work. It was the kind of reckoning that tends to arrive late and stay long. Priya, the young staff member who had overheard the fragment of Angela's phone call, was asked 2 months later to join the hotel's newly formed Service Excellence Committee, a group of 8 frontline staff members who would work directly with the incoming management team to develop the new training curriculum. She had been surprised by the invitation, then moved by it in a way she struggled to put into words. Someone had noticed her. Not her output, not her compliance, but her, the quality of her attention, the fact that she had stood with paper coffee sleeves in her hands and allowed herself to see something and let it matter. She accepted without hesitation. She was, it turned out, precisely the kind of person a hotel needed more of: attentive, perceptive, and possessed of a moral instinct that had survived intact, despite the culture she had briefly been trained into. The Grand Meridian formally became part of the Brooks Meridian Holdings portfolio on the 15th of December, a cold and clear day that felt, to the hotel's long-serving staff, like the beginning of something they had not known they were waiting for. The transition was methodical and thorough. New management came in, with a combination of warmth and accountability that Angela's properties were known for: managers who were experienced enough to lead and humble enough to listen, who understood that the point of standards was not to perform well when observed, but to behave the same way, whether or not anyone was watching. The Service Culture Training Program launched in January and ran for 6 weeks, covering not just customer interaction techniques but the deeper material: how bias operates in professional settings, how assumptions about worth are built, and how they can be dismantled, why dignity in service is not a courtesy but a requirement. The trainers Angela brought in were experienced practitioners who had worked with organizations across the hospitality sector, people who understood that the goal was not to teach staff a different performance, but to cultivate a different instinct, to get far enough beneath the surface of behavior that the surface behavior changed naturally and durably. The sessions were not comfortable in the way that all genuinely useful education is not comfortable. They required people to look at their own assumptions and ask where those assumptions had come from and whether they wanted to keep them. Several staff members later said it was the most important professional development they had experienced. One of them was Priya. Another was Marcus from the front desk, who went home after the first session and sat with his memory of the afternoon he had not immediately smiled at a woman who turned out to deserve his fullest attention, and decided that the lesson was not about her identity, but about the kind of professional he intended to become. The customer satisfaction scores began rising within the first quarter. By March, the Grand Meridian had its highest Net Promoter Score in 5 years. By April, 3 industry publications had noted the turnaround without knowing its origin story, attributing the improvement to the change in ownership and the new management philosophy. Staff turnover, which had been quietly elevated under the previous regime, a fact that Angela's acquisition team had flagged in their initial due diligence as a yellow indicator, but had not fully explained, dropped by nearly 40% in the first 4 months of operation under the new structure. People stayed when they felt respected. That was not a complicated equation. It had simply required the right conditions to prove itself. On a Thursday morning in early April, Angela Brooks walked through the revolving glass doors of the Grand Meridian for the second time. She was wearing the same kind of clothes she always wore on a visit like this. Comfortable, plain, nothing that announced anything. She carried her tote bag. She had taken the same flight from the same city and arrived at the same time of morning as any other business person coming into town for the day. The young man at the front desk looked up when she came through the door. He smiled, not the polished, calibrated smile of someone performing welcome, but the real kind, the kind that reaches the eyes and happens before the professional part of the brain has time to manage it. "Good morning," he said. And it landed the way genuine things land, simply and with weight. He did not know who she was. That was the point. He was simply greeting a person who had walked through his door with the same warmth he had offered the guest before her and the same warmth he would offer the guest after her, because that was the standard now, the standard that didn't require knowing who someone was before deciding whether they deserved it. Angela was shown to a table near the window when she asked about the breakfast service. She was offered coffee before she had to ask for it. The server who brought it, a woman about 30 years old, with a name tag that read, Diane, set it down with care, and asked whether she preferred anything with it. When Angela said no thank you, Diane smiled and said, "Enjoy," and moved on without hovering or retreating too quickly. The precise, calibrated grace of someone who had learned that good service is about making people feel comfortable rather than impressive. Angela sat with her coffee and looked out the window at the Thursday morning street. She thought about the lobby she had sat in on that September afternoon, how it had looked the same then as it looked now, the same chandeliers, the same marble floors, the same morning light coming through the tall windows. She thought about Daniel Carter's face in the conference room. She thought about Priya and the paper coffee sleeves and the expression of someone beginning to see something they hadn't seen before. She thought about the 9 complaints that had never been logged and the 6 that had been logged and not resolved, and the one woman traveling alone for work who had written that she had never been made to feel like an inconvenience before, and had clearly never imagined such a thing was possible. She finished her coffee. She took out her phone and opened her notes application, and she typed a short entry. Grand Meridian. April visit. Standards holding. Culture intact. The work continues. She ordered a second coffee and paid for it in cash, counting out the bills with the same unhurried care she had brought to every transaction in this hotel, and when the change came back to her in the proper way, placed carefully in her palm by a server who made brief eye contact and said thank you. She tucked it into her tote bag and looked around the lobby one more time. The chandeliers were the same chandeliers. The marble floors were the same marble floors. The piano was playing something quiet, near the east corridor, the same music that had played the day she walked in with a worn suitcase and sat in a navy chair and waited for the world to decide what kind of place this was going to be. What was different was not the architecture. What was different was the thing that architecture could never provide or replace or substitute for. The decision, made by every person working in this building, that every person who walked through those revolving doors was worth treating well, not because of what they looked like, not because of what they appeared to have, not because of what they might be worth to the quarterly revenue report, because they were a person, because they had walked through the door, because that was enough. Angela Brooks stood up from her table, slung her tote bag over one shoulder, and walked toward the exit with the quiet, settled feeling of a woman who has seen something important happen and knows it happened for the right reasons. At the front desk, the young man who had smiled at her when she came in looked up and said, "Have a great morning." She said the same back to him. She meant it. The revolving door turned, and she stepped through it into the April morning, and behind her, the Grand Meridian continued the slow and dignified work of becoming something better than it had been. There is a particular kind of arrogance that believes it can read a person's worth from the outside, from the fabric of their clothes, the condition of their luggage, the absence of the visible markers of money and status. It is an arrogance that has been practiced for so long, in so many places, by so many people who would never describe themselves as arrogant, that it has come to feel like common sense. It feels like efficiency, like discernment, like the reasonable management of limited time and attention. It does not feel like what it actually is: a refusal to see the full human being in front of you, and a willingness to use that refusal to diminish and exclude. Daniel Carter had built a career on that refusal. He was not, in his own telling, a cruel man. He was a practical man, a results-oriented man, a man who understood how business worked. He had never stopped to examine the gap between those self-descriptions and the reality of what he had been doing every day. The quiet, persistent damage of telling his staff not to waste time on certain guests, of letting coins fall to marble floors, of saying 2 words to a woman who had given him no reason for contempt, except that he had decided, in the 2 seconds it took for his eyes to sweep over her, that she was not worth his respect. Angela Brooks had spent 25 years building something with a different foundation. She had built it understanding, from her own long experience of being assessed and dismissed before she had spoken a word, that the culture of a business is not what it says about itself, but what it does when no one it considers important is watching. She had built a hotel group that was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, not in spite of that understanding, but because of it, because people who are treated with genuine dignity become loyal customers and proud staff and enthusiastic advocates in a way that no amount of marble and crystal and precisely calibrated piano music can manufacture. She had built it on the uncompromising belief that every person who walks through a door deserves to be treated as though they matter, not because they might turn out to be the owner of a luxury hotel chain, but simply because they are there, simply because they walked through the door. The coins on the floor of the Grand Meridian lobby had cost Daniel Carter everything he had spent 9 years building, but the real price had been paid long before that September afternoon, paid incrementally, over years, in the small change of other people's dignity that he had been taking, without acknowledgement and without remorse. The September afternoon was simply the moment the account was called. What Angela built in the months that followed was not a monument to her own vindication. It was something quieter and more durable, a hotel where the staff had been taught, in concrete and repeatable terms, that the person standing in front of them deserved their full attention regardless of what that person looked like, where the instinct to assess and sort and allocate care based on appearance had been named, examined, and deliberately replaced with a different instinct, the instinct to serve, fully and consistently and without reservation, every single person who came through the door. It was not a radical idea. It was, in fact, the most basic idea in hospitality. Welcome every guest. Treat every guest with care. Mean it every time. That idea had been in the Grand Meridian all along, written into the philosophy statements on the website, printed in the staff handbook, cited in the annual company meeting presentations. It had simply never been practiced. It had waited, patient and dormant, for the right conditions to become real. Angela Brooks had created those conditions, not by humiliating anyone, not by engineering a dramatic public reckoning, not by doing anything except walking through a door as herself, watching what happened, and then doing the slow, unglamorous, absolutely necessary work of changing what needed to change. She had changed it because it was right. She had also changed it because she understood, with the clarity that comes from 25 years of evidence, that it was good business. Those 2 things, she had always believed, were not in tension. They were, properly understood, the same thing. The morning light over the city stretched long and clear as she walked away from the Grand Meridian on that April Thursday. And somewhere inside the hotel behind her, a woman named Diane was refilling someone's coffee, and a young man at the front desk was smiling at someone he had never seen before, and the marble floors were holding up the weight of all of it, all the ordinary, essential work of treating people well, as they had always been built to do, waiting only for the people walking on them to be worthy of what they stood on. The chandeliers threw their warm light down on all of it without discrimination. The piano continued its quiet work near the east corridor, and outside in the April air, Angela Brooks walked toward the street with the same unhurried pace she had carried her whole life, the pace of a woman who has never needed the world to recognize her in order to know exactly who she is. She had walked into the Grand Meridian as herself, and she had walked out as herself, and in between, she had changed something real. That was enough. That was, in her long and considered experience, always enough.